Northern Montana, January 1891. The most respected builder in Flathead County stood in front of a half-finished cabin, looked the owner in the eye, and uttered 8 words that would haunt the valley for decades. "That steel box will freeze your family to death." He was not talking about poor timber or a weak foundation. He was pointing directly at 32 sheets of corrugated galvanized steel leaning against the lodgepole pine framing, metal siding that a quiet, determined homesteader named Caleb Vance planned to fasten over the entire exterior of his wooden cabin. The master builder raised his voice so the small crowd of neighbors gathering along the snow-dusted road could hear every word. "Steel conducts cold straight through to the wood," he warned. "You will wake up with thick frost on the inside walls and ice in your drinking water. It is foolish, it is dangerous, and it goes against everything this valley knows about survival." Caleb Vance did not argue. He did not raise his voice or try to defend his blueprint. He simply picked up his hammer and went back to work. By March of that very same winter, when the coldest recorded temperatures in Montana history locked the entire valley in a grip of bone-chilling wind and blue ice, Caleb's home was registering 72 degrees warmer on the inside than the surrounding homesteads. While neighboring families huddled around roaring fireplaces, helplessly burning through 4 cords of firewood every month in sheer desperation, Caleb's small stove burned slow and steady. It consumed less than 1/3 of the wood, held heat long after the embers faded, and kept his family walking around barefoot in the dead of winter. Today, you are going to understand how an idea that everyone ridiculed became the most copied shelter innovation in Western history. If you appreciate forgotten pioneer ingenuity and practical survival techniques that actually work when lives are on the line, hit that subscribe button right now. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from today, and stay with us until the end, because the exact physics and heat measurements that proved every expert wrong are almost unbelievable. Caleb Vance was not trying to invent a new architectural method. He was simply trying to keep his wife and 3 small children from freezing during their 3rd winter in northern Montana. The first 2 winters in Flathead County had taught him a harsh lesson that every pioneer learned the hard way. The standard frontier log cabin, no matter how thick the timber or how carefully chinked the gaps, was losing a losing battle against the Arctic cold. Wind found every microscopic seam. Radiant warmth escaped right through the wood. Deep frost crept through the logs, turning interior walls into sheets of ice. Homesteaders worked themselves to complete exhaustion cutting, hauling, and splitting heavy timber, only to watch that heat vanish into the night air minutes after the fire died down. Caleb had built his initial shelter by the book. He harvested seasoned lodgepole pine, 14 inches thick at the base. He filled every gap with thick clay, horsehair, and dried moss. He positioned the narrow gable end of the cabin directly toward the north to minimize wind resistance, and he installed a heavy stone hearth with a properly drafted firebox, just as the Territorial Agricultural Guide recommended. And yet, by December of 1890, his family was still freezing. His wife, Sarah, kept their 6-year-old daughter wrapped in every wool blanket they owned. The little girl coughed through the night, her breath turning to steam inside their own bedroom. Their firewood consumption was staggering. They were burning nearly 4 full cords a month, and the worst months of winter had not even arrived. Their neighbors were trapped in the exact same nightmare. A quarter-mile to the east, the Howard family had already lost a newborn infant to lung fever brought on by the damp, drafty air inside their cabin. The traditional method was failing everyone. It was not working, but people kept building the exact same way simply because nobody knew what else to try. That was when Caleb started asking a fundamentally different question. What if the real problem was not the cold getting in, but the heat constantly escaping? Log cabins, despite their iconic place in American history, were thermal sieves. Wood naturally expands and contracts with extreme temperature swings. As the temperature drops, tiny gaps open between the logs. Heavy wind pressure forces frigid air through cracks that are completely invisible to the human eye. Over time, even the best mud and moss chinking dries out, crumbles, and falls away. The entire structure breathes, and every breath steals precious heat from the room. Now, picture this. A few weeks earlier in town, Caleb had noticed something near the rail yard. The local grain storage building was clad entirely in corrugated galvanized steel panels nailed over a rough timber frame. Even during torrential rains and heavy mountain snows, the interior of that building stayed completely dry. The wind could not penetrate the steel seams. The frame inside did not shift or rot. Caleb began to wonder, what would happen if he wrapped metal around a log cabin? Not instead of the wood, but directly over it. A secondary skin, an outer shield that would never crack, never shift, and never allow a single gust of wind to pass through. A layer of steel that could seal the cabin like a vault, while reflecting radiant heat back toward the living space, instead of letting it bleed away into the frozen atmosphere. It was a radical thought. Nobody in Flathead County had ever attempted such a thing on a residential home. Steel was reserved for storage sheds, mining facilities, and industrial warehouses, not human living quarters. But Caleb was not interested in tradition. He was interested in keeping his children alive. He spent weeks mapping out the mechanics in his head. Steel conducts heat quickly, yes, but polished galvanized metal also reflects thermal radiation. Here is what everyone missed. If he could create an airtight wind barrier that trapped a layer of still, undisturbed air between the outer metal panels and the inner log walls, he would create a thermal envelope unlike anything ever seen on the frontier. The trapped air gap would act as a natural insulator. The metal panels would act as armor against the fierce northern winds, and the heavy log walls, shielded from direct rain, snow, and freezing wind, would act as a massive heat battery, storing the energy from the indoor stove and radiating it back into the room for hours. Traditional log cabins fought the cold with brute force and mass alone. They relied on thick timber and constant fire, but they were passive structures constantly bleeding heat to the elements. Caleb's concept was dynamic. It worked directly with the laws of physics, instead of fighting against them. In late December, Caleb hitched his draft horses and rode into the town of Kalispell. He spent a significant portion of his winter savings to purchase 32 sheets of 26-gauge corrugated galvanized steel, along with several bundles of 1-inch wooden furring strips and heavy-duty iron fasteners. The hardware store manager asked if he was putting up a grain bin. When Caleb told him he was wrapping his family cabin, the manager went completely silent, handed him his receipt, and shook his head as Caleb walked out the door. By the first week of January 1891, Caleb began installing the system. He did not nail the metal flat against the logs. Doing that would have trapped indoor moisture against the timber, causing condensation and rot within a single season. Instead, Caleb nailed 1-inch thick wooden furring strips vertically along the exterior logs, spaced exactly 16 inches apart. Then, he fastened the corrugated steel sheets directly to those wooden strips. This created a continuous 1-inch ventilated air cavity between the steel panels and the solid log walls. The metal sheets overlapped each other at the seams, shingled carefully from bottom to top, so that melting snow and rainwater would slough off effortlessly. When it was finished, the cabin looked completely foreign. It did not look like a traditional homestead. It looked like an industrial storage facility set against the snowy wilderness. Passing neighbors slowed their horses to stare. Caleb did not care, because he understood a basic scientific truth that the local master builders had overlooked. Thermal envelopes are not about traditional appearances. They are about fluid dynamics and thermal retention. Caleb's building design was deceptively simple, which made it easy for critics to ridicule and difficult for them to understand. To the untrained eye, wrapping a home in thin metal during a Montana winter seemed like wrapping a piece of meat in aluminum and putting it in a freezer. The local builder, Ephraim Hollister, who had over 20 years of timber construction experience in the territory, made a point to visit the site while Caleb was driving the final iron nails into the furring strips. "You are building a custom icebox, Vance," Hollister said, leaning against his saddle horn. "Metal is a thermal conductor. When the temperature drops to 30 below zero, that steel is going to soak up the cold and transfer it directly into your lodgepole timber. By mid-February, you will have 2 inches of solid frost on the inside of your bedroom walls, and your logs will rot right out from under you." A day later, the foreman of the local sawmill, a respected woodworker named Hank Kalb, stopped by to inspect the work. He stood in the snow with his hands on his hips, eyeing the bright galvanized steel shining in the winter sun. "That design is going to trap indoor moisture," Hank warned flatly. "The heat from your stove will hit those cold metal sheets, turn into liquid water on the inside of the gap, and rot your timber from the inside out. Give it 18 months. Your entire cabin will turn soft and spongy." The criticism was not just technical, it was deeply personal. In 1891, a pioneer cabin was expected to reflect hard work, traditional craftsmanship, and frontier pride. Exposed timber logs were a symbol of self-reliance. Caleb's cabin, encased in industrial galvanized sheet metal, looked cheap, strange, and reckless. People in town began whispering that Caleb was trying to hide lazy workmanship or cut corners on timber. One neighbor openly remarked at the general store that a man who builds a house that looks like a rail car must not care much about his family's safety. Even Sarah had quiet doubts. She never openly argued with Caleb, but he could see the hesitation in her eyes whenever she looked out the window at the gleaming steel panels. She knew what the town was saying, and she knew that if her husband was wrong, there would be no second chances once the deep Arctic freeze arrived. Think about that for a second. Imagine standing firm on a mechanical theory that nobody around you believes in, knowing that the safety of your wife and young children rests entirely on whether your calculations are correct. Caleb had accounted for every potential flaw. To address the threat of moisture buildup, he drilled tiny weep holes along the bottom flange of the metal panels, allowing any liquid condensation to drain harmlessly into the gravel foundation. He left small, screened ventilation gaps at the top and bottom of the vertical wall channels to create a continuous updraft of air within the cavity, carrying away humid air before it could ever settle on the wood. He even coated the exposed log ends with warm linseed oil to preserve the timber against moisture. He was not taking wild guesses. He was engineering a solution. The financial math was equally solid. The steel panels, furring strips, and heavy fasteners cost Caleb $50 in total. That was a substantial sum for a homesteader in 1891. But Caleb calculated that if the thermal envelope worked, he would cut his wood consumption in half. A typical homestead burned 4 to 5 cords of wood every winter month, costing roughly $20 to $30 in manual labor, horse feed, and hauling time per season. His $50 investment in steel would pay for itself in less than 2 winters, and the protected logs would remain pristine for generations without weathering or decay. Function over form had always been Caleb's rule. A home did not need to look like everyone else's home. It needed to keep his family alive. If it looked like a rail car or a grain silo, so be it. Pride does not generate heat during an Arctic storm. Physics does. Still, a heavy cloud of isolation settled over the Vance homestead. The county's most experienced carpenters had publicly declared the structure unsafe. Neighbors viewed the project as a dangerous experiment, and by mid-January, the sky turned a dark, bruised gray as the most severe cold front in Montana history began descending from the Canadian Rockies. The social pressure reached its absolute breaking point during a community emergency meeting at the Grange Hall in mid-January. The meeting had been called to coordinate firewood supplies and winter aid for vulnerable families across the valley. Families were already burning through their wood piles at an alarming rate, and the local timber mills could not keep up with demand. Caleb attended the meeting, sitting quietly near the back of the room. He had no intention of speaking, but the master builder, Ephraim Hollister, stood up during the open assembly and addressed the crowd directly. "We need to talk about dangerous construction practices in this valley," Hollister announced, his voice echoing off the wooden rafters. "There is a homesteader among us who has encased his entire cabin in galvanized sheet metal. I have built homes in Montana for 2 decades. I have seen cabins fail from bad foundations, green timber, and poor chinking. But I have never seen a man deliberately bolt a cold conductor around his own family." The room fell completely silent. Dozens of heads turned to look directly at Caleb. Hollister continued, his voice rising with conviction. "That metal box is going to freeze from the outside in. It will trap moisture, create thick frost on the interior timber, and turn into a freezer. When that structure fails during the coming storm, that family is going to need emergency shelter, and we are going to be the ones hauling them out of the snow." A low murmur of agreement rippled through the hall. Hollister was a veteran builder, and his opinion carried immense weight. Garrett Shaw, an older man who operated a freight line out of Kalispell, stood up next. "I have worked inside metal freight warehouses in the dead of winter," Shaw added. "They are bitter cold. You touch the inside steel wall with an bare hand, and your skin sticks right to the frost. Putting that material around a living space is not an improvement. It is an icebox." Sarah, sitting beside Caleb, sat up straight and rigid. Caleb reached down, caught her cold hand, and held it firmly. He did not stand up. He did not attempt to debate them. He had learned long ago that trying to explain thermal dynamics to people who have never seen the system work is a complete waste of energy. The verdict of the community was clear. Caleb Vance had built a dangerous death trap. Within days, local residents were referring to the Vance home as the steel icebox. Neighbors made cruel jokes about whether Caleb was planning to store frozen beef or grain inside his living room. The social cost was immediate and painful. Invitations to weekend gatherings stopped coming. When Caleb rode his wagon into town for basic supplies, storekeepers kept their answers short and cold. He was marked as an eccentric, a man who had strayed far beyond the boundaries of practical pioneer wisdom. Sarah bore the heaviest burden. At the local church, women spoke to her in hushed, overly polite tones, asking if her children were staying warm enough at night. One well-meaning neighbor offered to let Sarah and the children stay in her guest room once the real Arctic storm arrived, assuming it was only a matter of time before Caleb's experiment failed completely. The unspoken consensus was brutal. Caleb was not just building differently, he was failing as a father by exposing his young family to an untested hazard. Even 8-year-old Thomas came home from the local schoolhouse one afternoon with tears in his eyes, asking if their house was going to turn into ice. Caleb knelt down on the cabin floor, looked his son in the eyes, and told him with absolute quiet confidence, "Our home is going to be the warmest house in the entire valley, Thomas. You will see." By late January, the winter of 1891 delivered a blow that none of the homesteaders were prepared for. Temperatures across northern Montana did not just drop. They plunged into territory never before recorded in the region. Thermometers dropped to minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit, then minus 40, then minus 45. The cold was so intense that natural moisture inside standing pine trees froze solid, expanding until the trunks split open with loud, violent cracks that sounded like rifle shots echoing through the valley. Relentless northern winds howled across the open plains, driving wind chill factors down to minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Heavy, blinding snow fell in continuous waves, burying fence lines, blocking roads, and trapping families inside their shelters for days at a time. Firewood instantly became a matter of life and death. Cabins that had felt reasonably warm during mild weather suddenly exposed their fatal design flaws. Frigid air cut right through microscopic gaps in the wood. Chinking dried out and shattered under the extreme freeze, falling out in heavy chunks. Thick layers of white frost began creeping across interior log walls, forming intricate, icy patterns inside bedrooms and kitchens. Families burned through their timber reserves at a frightening speed. Men worked from before dawn until long after sunset, frantically felling frozen trees, splitting wood with numb hands, and hauling timber back to their cabins on hand sleds. The relentless labor left homesteaders exhausted, frostbitten, and terrified. The Howard family, who had already lost their newborn earlier in the season, abandoned their home entirely when their interior walls froze solid. They packed what little they could carry and fled to town to crowd into a relative's small kitchen. A mile to the south of Caleb's property, the Schaefer family burned through 6 full cords of wood in less than 3 weeks. Despite keeping their main stove roaring around the clock, they could not raise the air temperature in their main living room above 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Mrs. Schaefer suffered severe frostbite on 3 of her fingers simply from hanging laundry near an interior wall inside her own home. Nobody was mocking Caleb Vance anymore. Every family in Flathead County was far too busy fighting for their own immediate survival. And yet, as the relentless storm battered Flathead County, neighbors who passed anywhere near Caleb Vance's homestead began to notice something strange. Thin, Light smoke rose from Caleb's stone chimney. It was steady, but it was remarkably infrequent. He was not stoking a roaring, wild blaze around the clock like everyone else in the valley. His neatly stacked woodpile outside the cabin barely seemed to shrink. While other men were out in the howling wind, splitting frozen timber until their knuckles bled, Caleb's yard was quiet. One evening, well after dark, during a brief break in the driving snow, Hank Kalb, the sawmill foreman who had predicted that Caleb's walls would rot, rode past the Vance property on his draft horse after checking his trap line. The temperature hovered near -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Hank fully expected to see the frantic red glow of a desperate, stove-fed fire roaring through Caleb's windows. Instead, through the frosty glass, Hank saw the soft, calm light of a single kerosene lamp. There was no roaring fire. There was no smoke rising from the chimney at all. The stove had been banked hours ago. The corrugated steel siding, coated in a fine blanket of dry frost, gleamed quietly under the winter moon. Hank pulled his horse to a complete stop and stared. The cabin looked completely undisturbed by the Arctic storm. It was serene. The timber was not shifting, the roof was not sagging, and there was no frantic activity inside. Hank shook his head, pulled his collar up against the freezing wind, and rode on into the night, deeply unsettled by what he had just witnessed. By early February, the weather conditions worsened. The mercury dropped to -43 degrees Fahrenheit. Livestock froze solid inside unheated barns. Water buckets placed just 5 feet away from indoor fireplaces froze into solid blocks of ice overnight. The regional newspaper ran an emergency front-page notice, urging residents to consolidate households and check on isolated neighbors before the firewood supplies ran out completely. Ephraim Hollister, the master builder who had publicly condemned Caleb's blueprint at the Grange Hall meeting, was burning nearly 5 full cords of wood a week just to keep his own home above the freezing mark. His hands were raw, cracked, and wrapped in stained bandages. His wife and children slept in 4 layers of wool clothing, huddled together under every blanket in the house, because the air temperature near their interior walls dropped into the mid-20s by dawn. And then, on the morning of February 9th, somebody finally asked the question that nobody in town had wanted to speak out loud. How are the Vances doing out on the ridge? The question came from Pastor William Gaines, a respected local minister who had been traveling on horseback across the county to check on isolated families. Pastor Gaines had already visited 7 different homesteads. Everywhere he went, he found the same terrifying picture: families shivering near dying fires, wood supplies exhausted, interior walls thick with ice, and children suffering from dangerous bronchial coughs. He had deliberately saved the Vance homestead for last. He was terrified of what he would find. In his mind, he prepared himself for a tragedy. He pictured a frozen house, a family huddled around cold ashes, interior timber covered in sheets of frost, and Caleb frantically chopping down green timber in a desperate attempt to stay warm. The pastor had even packed 2 spare wool blankets, a slab of salted pork, and a 50-pound sack of flour on his pack horse to offer immediate relief. Stay with me here, because what happened next shocked the pastor to his core. When Pastor Gaines crested the ridge and rode onto Caleb's property, he did not find a family in crisis. He found Caleb Vance standing outside in the snow, calmly stacking split pine into his woodshed. He was working at a steady, unhurried pace, dressed in a standard coat without gloves. The main woodpile behind the house was still huge. Nearly 3 full cords of dry timber remained untouched. Thin, pale smoke drifted lazily from the chimney, indicating a small, slow-burning fire inside. The outer corrugated steel panels, frosty and clean, reflected the bright morning light. "Reverend," Caleb said, setting down a log and nodding a polite greeting. "I did not expect visitors in this weather." Pastor Gaines pulled his horse to a halt, staring at the intact woodpile and Caleb's calm demeanor. "I am making the rounds across the county, Caleb," the pastor said, his voice trembling slightly from the cold. "It is a bitter winter. I came to see if your family needed emergency rations or firewood." Caleb smiled warmly, wiped his brow, and gestured toward the heavy front door. "We are doing just fine, Pastor. Come inside, take off your heavy coat, and warm yourself up." Pastor Gaines dismounted, tied his horse to the hitching post, and stepped through the doorway of Caleb's metal-clad cabin. The moment he crossed the threshold, he stopped dead in his tracks. The interior of the home was warm. Not lukewarm, not barely tolerable, but comfortably, remarkably warm. It was the kind of deep, enveloping warmth that made a man instantly want to unbutton his heavy wool coat and stay a while. In the corner of the living room, the small iron stove let out a soft, steady hum. It was not red hot, it was not roaring, and it was not consuming firewood at a frantic pace. Inside the firebox, two medium-sized pieces of split pine rested quietly on a deep bed of glowing coals, releasing heat in a slow, perfectly controlled burn. Sarah Vance was sitting at the wooden kitchen table, calmly kneading bread dough. The three children were playing happily on the timber floor near the window, dressed in light cotton shirts and trousers. They were not wrapped in layers of heavy wool coats. They were not wearing mittens inside the house. In fact, Caleb's 4-year-old child was walking across the wooden floor completely barefoot. Barefoot in February, during the coldest Arctic freeze in Montana history. Pastor Gaines stared at the child's bare feet, completely unable to process what he was seeing. Then, he looked at the interior timber walls. There was no frost creeping across the lodgepole logs. There was no condensation dripping down the seams. There was no ice formed in the corners of the floorboards. The wood was bone-dry, solid, and completely dry to the touch. The pastor slowly walked over to the nearest log wall, pulled off his leather glove, and pressed his bare palm directly against the timber. It did not feel like ice. It felt neutral, almost warm, actively radiating stored heat back into the room like a heated masonry fireplace. Let that sink in for a moment. Outside, the wind was howling at -40 degrees Fahrenheit, freezing cattle in their tracks and turning neighboring cabins into icy draft boxes. Inside Caleb's steel-clad shelter, a mother was making fresh bread, children were playing barefoot, and the timber walls were holding 70 degrees of gentle heat. "Sit down, Pastor," Caleb said, hanging his hat on a wooden peg. "I will put the kettle on for fresh coffee." As the minister sat down in a wooden chair, still stunned, Caleb walked over to the iron stove. He did not add fresh wood. He simply adjusted the small iron damper on the flue pipe by 1/2 inch, keeping the slow ember bed perfectly balanced. "We stoked this fire 4 hours ago," Caleb explained calmly, as if discussing the morning weather. "This small bed of coals will keep the house at this exact temperature for another 6 hours before we even need to toss in another piece of pine. We burn about 1/4 of a cord of wood a week, sometimes less." Pastor Gaines quickly did the math in his head, his hands shaking slightly as he took out his leather pocket notebook. 1/4 of a cord per week. That was 1 full cord per month. The Schaefer family, just 1 mile down the road, was burning 2 cords of wood every 10 days and still shivering at 38 degrees Fahrenheit inside their living room. Ephraim Hollister was burning 5 cords a week and losing the battle against interior frost. Caleb Vance was using less than 25% of the fuel his neighbors were consuming, and his home was 40 degrees warmer. "How is this possible, Caleb?" Pastor Gaines asked, leaning forward on the table. "Everyone in town said the steel would turn this house into a freezer." Caleb poured 2 mugs of hot coffee, handed one to the pastor, and sat down across from him. "Here is what everyone missed, Pastor. Steel does not conduct cold into a house if you understand how heat and air actually move. Steel is an airtight barrier." Caleb tapped his fingers on the wooden table to emphasize his point. "Traditional log cabins do not get cold because timber is a bad material," he explained. "They get cold because wind forces its way through every tiny crack between the logs, blowing the warm air straight out through the roof. And as the logs freeze on the outside, they draw heat out of the room through direct conduction." Caleb pointed toward the outer wall. "What I built outside is an airtight shield. Those 26-gauge corrugated steel panels stop 20-mile-per-hour wind completely dead in its tracks. Not a single breath of freezing air can reach the logs." "Second," Caleb continued, "I did not nail the metal directly against the timber. I mounted it on 1-inch wooden furring strips. That created a sealed 1-inch cavity of still air between the outer steel and the inner log walls. Still air is one of the greatest heat insulators in the world. The steel gets cold on the outside, but it cannot transfer that cold across the air gap to the logs. Third, Caleb explained, polished, galvanized steel reflects thermal energy. When radiant heat tries to leak out through the lodgepole logs, it hits the interior side of the steel casing and bounces right back into the wall cavity. The log walls themselves absorb that heat, acting like a giant thermal battery. They store the heat from our small stove during the day, and they slowly radiate it back into the room all night long. The pastor listened intently, writing down every word in his notebook. But what about the moisture? Hank Kalb said the condensation would rot your wood. Caleb walked over to the base of the wall and pointed down at the floorboards. I left small weep holes along the bottom of the steel panels outside and tiny air vents under the roof eaves, he said. That allows a gentle, natural updraft within the 1-inch gap. Any moisture that forms inside the gap gets swept up and carried out through the top vent before it can ever touch the timber. The logs stay bone dry, protected from rain, snow, and wind. They will last 100 years without rotting. The physics was undeniable. Caleb had not built a metal freezer. He had built a high-efficiency thermal thermos. Pastor Gaines spent the next hour walking around the entire cabin, inspecting every corner, every wall seam, and every window frame. He brought out his mercury thermometer and took precise measurements across the living space. Near the iron stove, the thermometer read 71 degrees Fahrenheit. In the farthest corner of the bedroom, it read 67 degrees. Near the front door, where frigid air briefly entered when someone opened it, the temperature registered 65 degrees. There was not a single cold spot in the entire house. The numbers did not lie. Caleb's radical, ridiculed metal siding had created the most energy-efficient, comfortable, and warm homestead structure in the history of the Montana Territory. I need to tell the people in town about this, Pastor Gaines said, his voice filled with awe as he buttoned his heavy coat to leave. They will not believe you, Pastor, Caleb replied quietly with a humble smile. People do not change their minds because of words. They only change their minds when they see the numbers with their own eyes and feel the warmth for themselves. The pastor left the Vance homestead that afternoon, but he did not go straight home. He rode directly to the Schaefer property, 1 mile to the south, to measure the contrast. The reality at the Schaefer cabin was heart-wrenching. Inside, the main fireplace was roaring wildly, consuming logs every 15 minutes. Mr. Schaefer was exhausted, his face gaunt and pale from relentless labor. Yet, when Pastor Gaines pulled out his mercury thermometer, the air near the stove registered just 41 degrees Fahrenheit. In the back sleeping area, the thermometer dropped to 32 degrees, literal freezing point. Thick, milky frost covered the interior log walls, and ice had formed on the edges of the children's woolen blankets. Mr. Schaefer was burning 6 times more wood than Caleb Vance, yet his family was freezing in their own beds. That evening, Pastor Gaines rode straight into town and went directly to the workshop of Ephraim Hollister, the master builder. Hollister was outside by lantern light, frantically splitting frozen logs for his own home, his hands wrapped in bloody rags. Ephraim, you need to ride out to Caleb Vance's ridge right now, Pastor Gaines said, stepping into the lantern light. Hollister did not stop chopping. I have no interest in visiting a frozen wreck, Reverend. I told Vance that metal box would fail, and I am too busy keeping my own house warm to care. It is not failing, Ephraim, the pastor said firmly, holding up his leather notebook. It is 71 degrees inside his living room. His 4-year-old child is walking around barefoot on the timber floor, and he is burning less than 1/4 of a cord of wood a week. Hollister froze mid-swing, the iron axe resting on the chopping block. He stared at the pastor in complete disbelief. That is scientifically impossible, he snapped. Steel conducts cold straight through. Come see it for yourself, the pastor replied calmly. 2 days later, on a crisp, freezing morning, Ephraim Hollister rode out to the Vance homestead. He did not come alone. He brought Hank Kalb, the sawmill foreman, who had warned that the walls would rot from condensation. Both men were exhausted, skeptical, and deeply frustrated, fully expecting to find a trick or an exaggerated story. When Caleb opened the door and invited them inside, the wall of warm air hit the two builders instantly. Hollister pulled off his thick leather gloves, flexed his stiff, aching fingers, and stood motionless in the middle of the room. Hank Calb walked straight to the timber wall, pressed his bare hand against the logs, pulled it back, and then pressed it again, testing for dampness or ice. The timber was bone-dry, solid, and warm. "Show us your stove," Hollister demanded, his voice tight. Caleb opened the small iron door of the stove. Inside, two small logs rested quietly on glowing red coals, releasing a gentle, controlled heat. That was all. There was no roaring inferno, no pile of ash spilling onto the floor, and no frantic feeding of timber. Hollister pulled out a wooden measuring rule and his own thermometer, taking temperature readings across the room, just as the pastor had done. 72 degrees near the stove, 67 degrees along the north wall, 64 degrees by the entryway. "How much timber do you burn a day?" Hollister asked, his voice barely above a whisper. 3 to 4 small pieces," Caleb answered truthfully. "Maybe 5 if the wind picks up out of the north. About 1/4 of a cord a week." Hollister looked down at his notebook, then looked up at Caleb. The proud master builder, who had spent 20 years constructing traditional log cabins in Montana, looked completely defeated. "I am burning a full cord every 4 days," Hollister admitted quietly. "My family sleeps in coats, and my interior walls are covered in ice." Hank Calb walked around the perimeter of the living room, carefully inspecting the baseboards, the ceiling joints, and the window frames. "There is no moisture," Hank said, looking directly at Caleb. "There is no condensation, no rot, and no frost. Your ventilation system is working perfectly." The sawmill foreman took a deep breath, looked Caleb in the eye, and spoke 4 words that echoed through the room. "I was completely wrong." Hollister closed his leather notebook, looked around the warm room, and took a long, quiet breath. The math was simple, elegant, and completely undeniable. The galvanized sheet metal, wooden furring strips, and fasteners had cost Caleb $50. That single $50 investment reduced his wood consumption by more than 70%, saving him over $30 a year in physical labor, timber hauling, and horse feed. The metal cladding paid for itself in less than 2 winters. Beyond that, it offered pure economic savings year after year, while completely protecting the primary lodgepole timber from rot, weathering, and insect damage for decades. Hollister did not offer a dramatic apology, but he did not need to. The physical measurements recorded in his notebook had already spoken for him. Word of Caleb Vance's metal-clad cabin swept through Flathead County far faster than the Arctic cold ever could. The news spread from homestead to homestead, carried by Pastor Gaines and confirmed by the county's most respected master builder. During the very next Sunday service at the local church, Pastor Gaines delivered a sermon centered on humility, open-mindedness, and the danger of letting traditional pride blind people to practical truths. He spoke openly about Caleb's home, describing the barefoot children, the warm timber walls, and the incredible fuel efficiency of a structure that the entire valley had once mocked. Ephraim Hollister, to his eternal credit, did not attempt to hide his mistake or protect his reputation. At the next Grange Hall community meeting, the master builder stood up before a packed room of homesteaders and spoke plainly into the silence. "I told Caleb Vance that his metal cabin would turn into an icebox and freeze his family," Hollister declared, his voice echoing across the room. "I stood in front of you weeks ago and called his blueprint dangerous. I was completely wrong. His building design works better than any timber cabin I have constructed in 20 years of working in this territory. His family is warm, his timber is dry, and he burns less wood in a month than most of us burn in a single week." The assembly sat in complete, stunned silence. Hollister was not a man who admitted defeat lightly. His professional authority had been built on decades of strict adherence to traditional frontier methods. For him to stand before the entire county and publicly endorse Caleb's radical innovation carried immense weight. A few days later, Hank Calb, the sawmill foreman, rode back out to the Vance homestead with a sketchbook in hand. "Show me every single detail, Caleb," Hank requested earnestly. "Teach me how to set the furring strips, how to calculate the air cavity, and how to set the weep vents. I have 3 local families asking me to help them build cabin additions this coming spring, and I want to put metal siding on every single one of them." Caleb spent the entire afternoon walking the foreman through the exact mechanics. He explained the essential balance of the 1-inch air gap, the importance of vertical furring strips to allow natural updrafts, the correct overlap of the corrugated steel sheets, and the placement of bottom weep holes to ensure liquid drainage. He shared his design freely, refusing to charge a single cent or keep his method a secret. Word quickly reached the town of Kalispell. The hardware store manager who had originally doubted Caleb suddenly found himself inundated with inquiries from local farmers and builders. Homesteaders began asking for corrugated galvanized steel panels by the dozen. By late February, the hardware store had completely exhausted its entire inventory of sheet metal and was forced to place an urgent telegraph order with a major industrial supplier in Helena. The transformation across Flathead County was swift and widespread. Homesteaders did not tear down their existing log cabins to start over. That would have been financially impossible. But as soon as spring arrived and the ground thawed, wrapping existing homes in metal siding became the most sought-after structural modification in the region. The Breenage family, who had suffered terribly through the Arctic freeze while burning 5 cords of timber a month, hired a local carpenter to install galvanized steel siding over their north and west log walls, the sides most exposed to the punishing Canadian winds. The very next winter, their firewood consumption dropped by 40%, and their interior drafts vanished completely. The Schaefer family, whose children had huddled under frozen blankets near an open fireplace, went even further. They hired Ephraim Hollister to wrap their entire home in corrugated galvanized steel, following Caleb's exact air gap blueprint. Mrs. Schaefer, who had lost feeling in her fingers from frostbite the previous winter, reported that their indoor air temperature remained consistently above 65 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the bitterest nights, using less than half the firewood they had previously required. By the spring of 1893, just 2 years after Caleb had driven the first nail into his controversial metal panels, 17 homes within a 50-mile radius of the Vance homestead had incorporated corrugated steel siding into their construction. Some families wrapped their entire homes, while others clad only the windward walls. A few builders experimented with slightly wider air gaps or modified vent caps, an airtight outer metal shield that eliminated wind penetration, reflected radiant heat, and trapped a static air layer against the timber. The construction technique became known throughout western Montana as Vance Cladding. Caleb never sought fame, never applied for a patent, and never tried to monetize the innovation. Whenever a neighbor came to his property asking for advice, Caleb would grab his tools, walk over to their land, and help them measure their furring strips to ensure their ventilation gaps were installed correctly. Ephraim Hollister became one of the strongest advocates for the system. He made galvanized steel siding a standard option for all new residential projects. By 1894, nearly half of all new homes built in Flathead County featured metal-clad thermal envelopes. "It may not look like a traditional pioneer cabin," Hollister would tell prospective clients with a smile, "but it works. And in a country where winter temperatures drop to 40 below zero, keeping your family warm matters a whole lot more than looking like everyone else." The social tension that Caleb and Sarah had endured slowly melted away. Invitations to community gatherings resumed. Conversations outside the church were no longer polite or pitying. They were filled with genuine respect. The Vance family was no longer viewed as foolish or reckless. They were celebrated as practical innovators who had solved a fundamental survival challenge that the valley had endured for decades. Sarah noticed the shift most clearly in the quiet moments. Neighboring women who had once offered her pity now came to her kitchen asking for advice on indoor temperature management and moisture prevention. She answered their questions with patience and grace, explaining how the dry indoor air prevented mildew and kept their clothes warm and fresh. Caleb's children, who had once been teased at school about living in a steel box, now listened as classmates proudly bragged that their own fathers were putting metal siding on their homes, just like Caleb Vance. During the winter of 1893 into 1894, another severe Arctic cold snap slammed into northern Montana. Temperatures dropped to -35 degrees Fahrenheit, and fierce winds swept down the mountain valleys. But this time, there was no widespread panic. The homesteads that had adopted Caleb's metal-clad design sailed through the winter comfortably, burning half the fuel of unclad cabins and maintaining warm, frost-free living spaces. The proof was no longer a matter of opinion or debate. It was measurable, repeatable, and undeniable. Over the next decade, the technique spread far beyond the borders of Flathead County. Homesteaders in Wyoming, Idaho, and the Dakota Territories, hearing about the success of the metal cabin method through word of mouth, regional agricultural journals, and traveling freight drivers, began adopting similar thermal envelope systems. The basic principle was adapted to different climates and materials, but the fundamental mechanical truth remained constant. Work with the laws of physics, not against them. Caleb Vance lived in his metal-clad cabin for the rest of his life. He continued to burn less than a quarter cord of wood a week every winter, watching his children grow up healthy, strong, and warm. On cold winter evenings, when the mountain winds howled across the ridge and the outer steel panels hummed softly with the vibration of the storm, Caleb would sit by his iron stove, holding Sarah's hand, and reflect on the winter of 1891. He remembered the loud mockery at the Grange Hall, the skeptical glances from townspeople, the fear in his wife's eyes, and the unforgettable moment when Pastor Gaines had walked through their front door and realized that everything the valley believed about winter survival was wrong. Caleb had not been reckless. He had simply been practical. And sometimes, the most practical thing a human being can do is ignore the loud opinions of the crowd, tune out the fear of looking different, and trust what the laws of nature prove to be true. 72 degrees warmer. That was not a lucky guess, and it was not an exaggeration. That was the measured temperature difference between Caleb Vance's steel-clad homestead and the freezing timber cabins of Flathead County during the coldest winter in Montana's history. While others burned through entire forests of timber, trying to fight the cold with brute force, Caleb used physics to lock the warmth inside his home. The metal siding that experts called a foolish icebox became the single greatest structural advancement in frontier building history. The ultimate lesson of Caleb's story goes far beyond building design, timber walls, or thermal envelopes. It is about the vital courage required to choose truth over tradition and results over acceptance. Caleb Vance did not care if his home looked like a warehouse. He cared about keeping his family alive. And when the ultimate test arrived, his radical design did not just survive the storm, it set a new standard for generations to come. Traditional wisdom is not always correct. Sometimes the mockery comes long before the mastery, and sometimes the very idea that everyone laughs at is the exact solution that changes everything. Which part of Caleb's thermal design would you apply to your own home or off-grid shelter today? Drop a comment below and tell us where you are watching from. If this historical story taught you something valuable today, hit that subscribe button, share this video with a friend who appreciates practical survival wisdom, and stay tuned for our next deep dive into forgotten history. Stay warm, stay smart, and never let the crowd convince you that practical innovation is impossible. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific narrative dialogues are dramatized historical representations, while the architectural techniques, thermal envelope principles, and physical concepts discussed are based on real historical practices and established building science. Any modern construction or off-grid application should be thoroughly evaluated according to current building codes, engineering standards, and safety guidelines. This content is provided strictly for educational entertainment and does not constitute professional engineering, architectural, or legal advice.